Video games have always been my favorite way to experience horror. While I do love horror media and various other creative mediums, to me games have always felt much more personal and engaged with how they present their horror. They scare players in a way that feels more centered on them than a movie or book, since the player is directly controlling the character that's in danger instead of just simply watching these events play out. All the tension, the scares, and the overall fate of the character is controlled by you. In my opinion, that just leads to a much more engaging horror experience. So when I started hearing nothing but great things about a little horror game that came out called Signalis absolutely everywhere a few months ago, I was really looking forward to giving it a shot and seeing how it was. Though I will admit I had my reservations despite these glowing reviews. While the game did look cool from what I was seeing and everyone was talking about it in a really positive way, I was a little worried about getting overhyped on it, since I tend to go into things I hear nothing but rave reviews for and come out kind of disappointed because I end up expecting far more from it than what's actually in the thing being raved over. I have to say though, I was pleasantly surprised by the game. Signalis is an absolute love letter to survival horror that was made by the two-person studio Rose Engine and published by Humble Games in late 2022. It's a game that is heavily inspired by the PSX and PS2 era of horror games in a way that I haven't really seen done before. I'll get more into what I mean with that throughout the video, but the game presents itself in a way I am absolutely enthralled by. But as usual, I'm getting a bit ahead of myself here. I should probably actually start the review instead of dragging out the intro trying to talk about how much I like this game without actually talking about it in detail, huh? As always, there'll be a ton of spoilers for this game. If you have any interest in experiencing this game blind, I recommend pausing this video here and quickly going and playing the game. Otherwise, feel free to strap in and get comfy. With that out of the way, I'm Jay, and let's talk about Signalis. The game starts with our main character Elster, an LSTR class replica droid for the nation of Usan, in a crashed space shuttle called the Penrose 512 as she tries to find her gestalt, Alina. To explain some of these terms real quick, replicas are robots made with copies of human brains that are used as the main parts of Usan's military and workforces. There are several different models of replica that are made with different purposes throughout the colonies. They also have little quirks stemming from their original brain scan that they must indulge or else they destabilize. Gestalts, meanwhile, are the human overseers of the replicas. With that explained, after Elster gets out of the ship, she eventually finds the Sierpinski 23 mining colony. She came here under the impression that Alina was sent here. Upon arriving, however, she soon finds that some things are extremely wrong in the facility. Right out the gate, almost everyone is either dead or some kind of mindless monster bent on destruction. The place is falling apart and barely anything works. There's meat everywhere, you get the idea. Elster has to navigate through this extremely dangerous facility as she gathers supplies, jumps down holes, fends off hordes of angry zombified replicas, and tries to find where Alina's disappeared to. She eventually runs into Alder, the second in command of the facility, and overall just a guy who looks just a little too untrustworthy if you ask me. See? What'd I tell ya? It's alright though, after a little dream sequence we wake up on a suspiciously large pile of other LSTR replicas and continue on. In this new area of the map, we eventually end up finding Adler's diary as well as information about all the other types of replicas and learn what causes these different models to fall apart, as well as the fact that Adler believes the station to be stuck in a time loop. Elster doesn't really think about the possible deeper meaning to this and instead just presses on further into the mines, before eventually ending up in the meat dimension. Here she saves Alina, who has somehow survived through all of this only for Elster to realize that Alina is not who she was searching for, and is not her gestalt from the prologue of the game. Elster carries on and escapes from the meat dimension only to find a visually striking room with an altar where Adler is having a tantrum. Elster leaves him behind and finds the ship she crashed onto the planet with at the beginning of the game. She tries to break open the hatch to get back in but disarms herself and passes out. Elster dreams of Irina, her actual gestalt, where we learn of their romantic relationship and how they came into the situation at the start of the game. Before the dream ends, Elster is asked if she remembers the promise that she made to Irina. Elster wakes up, loots a corpse of another Elster unit, and jumps through another hole to somehow re-enter the colony. This time, however, it seems like the meat room is slowly leaking into the rest of the world. Elster then somehow ends up back on Rotfront, the planet Irina called home before being shipped out into space. Here she learns about Irina's past, namely that she only signed up for the Penrose program to escape being bullied by the people in her hometown. Eventually, after playing tourist for long enough, Elster comes face to face with the replica Falk, who's the former leader of the Sierpinski 23 mining colony before the Penrose 512 crash landed and caused Falk to inherit Elster's memory, leading to her having a bit of an identity crisis, I'll say. Falk tries to kill Elster, Elster shoots her a ton, and then she returns to Adler's time timeout zone and shoots him in the face as he stabs Elster with a knife. Mortally wounded, she returns to the wreckage of the Penrose 512 for the final time. When she gets there, it's revealed that the player of the Penrose shuttle did not find a suitable planet to land on, the pilot and the replica were not intended to return home. Eventually, Irina came down with a degenerative disease due to this and was slowly dying. It's revealed here that the promise Elster made was to kill Irina, but instead Elster put her back in a cryopod so she wouldn't have to fulfill this promise. Now, when we return to the Penrose 512, there are actually 4 different endings to the game from this point forward, and it depends entirely on how the player played throughout the game up to this point. I only had footage for one of the endings since I only played through the game once, and I'll just be showing footage from that ending since I didn't really want to play through the entire game again to get the other ones. I'll probably link to a compilation of them down below though, just to make it easier for other people to find them. I'm just going to go through the endings in the order they're listed on the wiki. So first we have the leave ending, which has Elster refuse to go into the room with the cryopod and kill Irina, instead deciding to leave and let her wounds consume her out in the wasteland. The second ending, called the memory ending, which is what I got, has Elster awaken Irina, but her condition has worsened to the point where she cannot remember who Elster is. Elster cannot bring herself to kill Irina in this state, and asks Irina to just stay by her side until Elster passes away from her wounds. In the third ending, dubbed the promise ending, Irina wakes up and remembers Elster. After asking her once again to keep her promise, Irina is killed by a reluctant Elster before Elster succumbs to her own wounds. The final ending, the artifact ending, can only be found if you found 3 secret keys throughout the game that unlocked a safe at the end. The safe contains a vase of white lilies that Elster uses to essentially cause her own death. We then see Elster dancing with a healthy Irina, which to me at least implies that they have both passed on. Now I will say that while there are a number of direct answers to what is going on in the game in the form of little lore notes and such left around, a bit of this is speculation on my part, such as the description of the artifact ending, since this game does leave more than a few things open-ended intentionally. I honestly think that's one of the biggest strengths of this game's storytelling, knowing when to give the player information and when to withhold it. In my opinion, horror media is at its best when it doesn't give the person experiencing it every piece of the puzzle. Not knowing something in a horrific situation just adds to the tension and adds to the horror of what you're going through. We don't know why Falk is infected with Elster's memories or how this has corrupted the entire station the way that it has. We just know that it has, and that's destroying everything. There are plenty of different things throughout the game that all raise questions but don't have answers, and I think that's great for this type of game. In my opinion, this is exemplified with how many different readings there can be of the artifact ending. There's so many different ways to interpret this ending. Like, I personally saw it as them both passing on and meeting again in some form of the afterlife. However, I have also seen this interpreted as Elster breaking the loop and then finally being able to be together again, or a creative metaphor for Elster keeping the promise in a different way from how the promise ending shows it take place. It's fascinating, and I absolutely love this game's ambiguity around it. I did mention earlier that the game has a lot of small notes kind of describing aspects of the world of Signalis, and while this is a pretty standard fare for horror games, I did find the information actually contained in these interesting. The ones talking about the different types of replicas, their idiosyncrasies, and what to not do around them in order to keep them from going insane was really interesting to me, and absolutely made my stomach drop at a later point in the game when I found the one for the LSTR units in the flashback to when Elster and Ariana were alone on the Penrose, and finding out from that all the stuff the two of them had been doing together in their relationship was strictly off limits for LSTRs because it would mentally break them really got to me. This little note not only suddenly adds a lot of questions to the narrative, like, you know, is Elster broken, and is her being broken that way why everything in the world ended up how it did? Did it actually break her, or is those things breaking the units just what the Yusan nation wants Gestalts to think so replicas don't gain their own thoughts and wants outside of their mission? It's really compelling, and again, I think little ambiguous things like that really add a lot to the narrative. Circling back real quick so I can touch further on Elster and Irina's relationship, I have to say, I am actually really happy that they were just straight up lesbians in this game. So often in media, queer themes have to be danced around, shoved into the background, or only talked about metaphorically due to corporations fearing out on missing on the money from the portion of the population that still has a stick up their ass about people wanting to love who they love. This has been better in more recent times, but even then, there's still a lot of restrictions on what, you know, queer things can happen in media. So the fact that the creative duo behind this game just let them be gay and made that a major plot point is great to me. I'm really hoping that more stuff like this just allows more queer games to, you know, exist and have more queer characters at the forefront. It's a refreshing change of pace from some of the other things I've seen recently where there are clearly gay themes, but the creators weren't allowed to go through with it fully. Overall, I really like the plot of Signalis, and their approach to storytelling is absolutely great for a video game in my opinion. I love the world Rose Engine set up, and the way it's shown off and woven into the narrative throughout the story is really cool. Man, there's so much more I could talk about with this game, but in the interest of not talking your ear off for a few hours, I'm going to move on to the next section here. If you have any interest in the story from what I've talked about, and you haven't played the game yet, I highly recommend going and playing through the game. Speaking of actually playing the game, Signalis' gameplay is full of really solid takes on old school survival horror mechanics. The game is primarily played from a top-down perspective where you have to try and use the weapon you have at your disposal in order to fight through various different enemy types to survive. The weapons are broken into two different types, guns and what I call reaction weapons. There are several different guns throughout the game that all do different things. You get your standard pistol that does little damage but has a lot more ammo around so you can use it more often. There's a shotgun that while it has short range and lowish damage, it does stun enemies, a rifle that has long range and high damage but with extremely long reload times and recoil after firing, a quick-fired machine gun that does exactly what it says on the tin, a revolver that does high damage but is much slower and has lower ammo capacity than the pistol, and a flare gun which burns enemies alive right before your eyes. Personally, I just kinda stuck to the default pistol for most of the game since I was saving all my ammo for the stronger guns for boss encounters, and then just kinda didn't use them in most boss monster encounters because I'm an idiot. Beyond that, the revolver was my favorite weapon. It's always pretty fun to use in games, and the flare gun is just objectively the best gun in the game if you have the ammo for it. I'll get into why in a minute, but first let me talk about what I call the reactive weapons. So there's only two of these, but there's disposable stun batons and flares. The stun batons can be used whenever an enemy gets too close to you in order to do damage and knock them away from you, hopefully giving you enough time to get away, reload, and then fire off a few rounds into your attacker. Pretty standard stuff. Think of them like the knives from the Biohazard games. The flares, however, have a different purpose. See, in this game, when you kill an enemy, that doesn't necessarily mean they're dead. Similar to the remake of Biohazard 1, an enemy that has been defeated doesn't have their body disappear. It stays there indefinitely since eventually the enemy can revive itself, unless you use a flare to burn that body, which permanently takes it out of the equation. Remember like a minute ago when I said the flare gun was the strongest gun in the game? Yeah, this is why. It just shoots these things and completely burns the body and instantly kills the enemy forever. The trade-off for this though is that there's next to no ammo for it in the game, so you need to use it really wisely. Despite having all these tools at your disposal, you're not going to be able to use them all at once. Throughout the entire run of the game, you have to manage an inventory of only 6 slots, which are taken up by the weapons I mentioned above, ammo for them, healing items, and key items that you need to proceed. You constantly have to run back to the item boxes that can be found at save points to switch out your inventory and keep what you need at that moment on you. This may sound a bit tedious, but with how close by an item box is at almost all times, it's not really much of a concern in my opinion. It does make the tension increase a lot though when you have to continually run through hallways with a ton of enemies in order to get an item back to a safe room though. Generally, when you have to keep running back and forth like this, and with the way the game encourages you to run for the most encounters so you can serve your supplies, it makes every decision count that much more. Do you fight and waste some of the ammo you may need later, or do you keep trying to run back and forth between the enemies that get closer and closer each time you go through a room? It's honestly incredible in how it managed to make the player balance those decisions and think things through. On the topic of thinking things through, the game also has some of the best puzzles I've seen in a horror game. I'm not going to spoil anything specific because I had a ton of fun figuring them out, but just go in knowing you really gotta think for a lot of these. I will say that an element that is used in a lot of puzzles though is the radio. You can use the radio throughout the game to check for certain frequencies in certain puzzles and situations to help you advance. This thing honestly gets used a lot more throughout the game than I would have expected, and I think it's really cool how it gets incorporated. There's even an enemy type that you can only beat using the radio, and I think that rocks. They really wanted to make this mechanic a central part of the game, and I love that. If you couldn't tell already, Signalis' gameplay is something I greatly enjoyed as a fan of older survival horror games. The devs behind this game managed to take a lot of tried and true gameplay mechanics and make them feel fresh again. I'm honestly super impressed that they managed to pull this off, and talking about it here is kind of making me want to start up another run through of the game already. But unfortunately, I have a review to finish, or else my bosses will bring out the wrench again, so, let's move on. This is normally the part of the video where I talk about the music, and while the music in the game is phenomenal, I actually wanted to take this chance to talk a bit about the sound design in the game. Sound design is essential to a horror experience, and this game absolutely knocks out of the park in that regard. The noises the enemies make, the intensity of the gunshot sounds, the natural background noise of the various broken machines in the colony, it all blends together in such a great way that I absolutely adore. Not to mention that there's also the soundtrack playing subtly in the background, helping add to the atmosphere of the game. It all comes together in a very masterful way where every sound just adds to the tone the game is trying to convey. It's honestly impressively well done in a way that makes it stand out amongst other horror games. I think the thing that makes Signalis stand out the most though is the way that it manages to recapture the feeling of an era that's long gone. Despite having a very different setting from most horror games of the early 3D era of gaming, it manages to evoke the same feeling those games did. I'm not one of those people who thinks horror games were only good back in those days. Hell, some of my favorite horror games like the Biohazard 2 remake are modern games. But it is undeniable that the early period of 3D gaming, when everything was still being figured out, has some really unique takes on horror in video games that most modern games don't quite recapture. Playing them as an adult, they were never quite scary in themselves the entire way through, but they had their moments, and regardless of that, they were always incredibly tense and kept the player on their toes. I feel like Signalis recaptures these feelings in a way that other games trying to replicate that era don't really manage to. I mean, hell, there's a reason I call it the best Silent Hill game since 2004. Even one of the series that popularized survival horror wasn't able to recapture the feeling that those first 4 games had cultivated. It's similar with the Biohazard games. While I love the entire franchise, minus the obvious bumps in the road, the newer entries have a different approach to horror and tension than what the predecessors were aiming for. Neither attempt is inherently better than the other, but they do scratch different itches, at least for me. I think the way that Signalis manages to perfectly capture this feeling shows a mastery of the genre from the 2 developers on this game that honestly astounds me. Everything from the gameplay, to the controls, to the visuals, to how even the UI and inventory work just feels so in line with the design philosophy of the time that it feels like the game that came out back then, and I mean that in the best way possible. Something I've heard repeated often throughout my time in college and throughout the various writer circles I'm in is the phrase from T.S. Eliot, "Good writers borrow, great writers steal." And I think that applies here as well. Signalis took so much from other great horror games and managed to make something original yet familiar out of those elements in the best way possible. I'm slightly dating myself here, but I wasn't exactly sentient enough to play video games when the PSX era of horror was in full swing, so there's not exactly nostalgia for them from me, other than enjoying a lot of them immensely when I was in my late teens and wanting to go back and experience some series I'd missed out on growing up. Kinda like what I'm doing now with this video series. I love looking back at the history of games. I have to say the fact that Signalis was able to make such a thorough modern look at the classical elements of the horror genre makes me think that ultimately this game will stand the test of time and be remembered as a classic in the same vein as those games. So where does that leave Signalis on the tier list? Well, we made it this far, you should not be surprised at all that it's in S tier. This game is an easy 10 out of 10 for me, and it's something I'll remember fondly for a long time. You know, it's kind of funny in retrospect how last episode I said the tier list would probably have a greater diversity of placements after the episode, but I just honestly was not expecting to love this game as much as I ended up liking it. But also, hey, there isn't exactly a problem with me liking things on my own show. I will say though, with us starting strong like this, it will be really interesting to me to see what the final tier list ends up looking like at the end of the season. And with that, that's all I really have to say about Signalis. Thank you for joining me today on this episode of Jay Talks About Games. I'm going to try to continue uploading episodes every other Friday, so stay tuned for that if you like this episode. I've done pretty good at that so far, so I'm assuming it's going to keep going up every other Friday. Beyond that, there's a few more things going up on Disc 3 from my friends and I, which I'll have links to on screen and in the description down below. Be sure to check those out if you enjoyed this, since everything else we're working on is pretty great as well in my opinion. Oh, and if you want to see episodes a week early, feel free to subscribe to us on our Patreon, which I will have linked in the description down below. And while I'm shamelessly promoting myself, feel free to like, comment, and subscribe, since that's the only way for YouTube to push our videos to bigger audiences and for us to be able to do more things. And yeah, I've been Jay, and thank you for listening to ramble about one of the best horror games I've played in years. See y'all next time.